Namaste and greetings. I, Ishika Chaudhary, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, प्रभाव एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली, extend my warm welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today we have gathered for a special talk on urban political economy and governance by Dr. Shahana Chattaraj as a part of the series, The State of Cities #City Conversations. The series is organized by IMPRI, Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies. The series is being moderated by Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor Economics, Visva-Bharati, Santi-Niketan, and Visiting Senior Fellow at IMPRI. I invite Dr. Chattopadhyay to take the proceedings further, and we look forward to learning from my esteemed gathering. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishika, and a very good evening to all of you. Just before the start of today's talk, let me just say a few words about this city conversation series. The rationale behind starting this city conversation series, and we all know that this pace and growth of urbanization in India poses enormous challenges to the urban governance, and two major concerns are there. One is how to improve the quality of life in India's rapidly growing urban areas, and also how to transform the Indian cities to play their role as engines of growth. And to achieve these world-class urban system, policies from 90s onwards started to embrace the philosophy of new public management and put emphasis on decentralization, then increasing private sector involvement in the planning processes, emphasis on this financial discipline, the market-based finance for cities, and so on. And we have seen that the task of policymaking and governance are increasingly being negotiated by different institutional forms, starting from special purpose vehicles, the parastatal bodies, the quasi-autonomous government organizations, and several non-state actors, for example, business leaders, elite, middle-class organization, civic activists, and so on. So naturally, such kind of transformation requires some in-depth sort of interrogation of at least 3-4 aspects. For example, the nature and state practices of the restructuring of the urban space and the modes of governance, the mechanisms through which the different actors get involved in these new spaces and exert their influence on urban development policies, and also what are the outcomes in terms of their implications for spatial and social development. And in the City Conversation Talk series, we invite the experts on urban and regional studies to discuss and deliberate on these type challenges of urbanization and how to make the cities more sustainable, more inclusive. And today we are delighted to have with us Dr. Shahana Chattaraj, who is the Director of Research, Data and Innovation at WRI India, and a visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. And she is also a part of WRI's Global Governance, Poverty and Social Equity Task Force. And at WRI, she is involved in mentoring the researchers across WRI programs and overseeing the research strategies and publications review. And her research interests lie in the areas of urban governance, policy and planning, comparative urbanization and development, the informal economy and the informalization, and also the future of work. And she has published quite a few number of articles in reputed journals on leading journals on industrial corridors and mega projects, informal housing markets, Mumbai's political economy and governance. And also she is currently the co-investigator in an IDRC-funded project on women, work and the gig economy in India and Sri Lanka, which is in collaboration with CPR, Just Jobs Networks, IIHS, and Lirna Asia. And earlier also, she worked for several years as a program specialist in the United Nations Population Fund in New York, and also associated with the World Bank's Development Research Group as consultant. And today, her title of talk is Iron Cage Meets Makeshift Shed, the Jugaad State in Mumbai. And also, we are very, very pleased to have with us urban scholars who are very well known. Dr. Diganta Kumar, who is the Associate Professor of Geography at National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and Dr. Neha Shami, who is the lead of academic and research, Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Bengaluru, and also Dr. Arindam Biswas, who is associate professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. So with this short introduction, let me now invite our speaker today, Dr. Shahana Chattaraj, to begin her talk. So it's over to you, Dr. Chattaraj.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Thank you so much, Dr. Soumyadip, Dr. Diganta Kumar, IMPRI, for inviting me here for this talks. Dr. Soumyadip, my parents actually studied at and met at Santi-Niketan, though I've never visited. Hopefully after this pandemic is over, I can actually go and visit the place. Are you there now or in Delhi?
No, right now I'm in Kolkata.
Okay. Right. So what I'm going to present now is a piece of a larger research project which actually addresses some of the bigger questions that Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay talked about, these kind of large-scale efforts to kind of transform our cities, to make them more globally competitive, these new sorts of actors that have started operating in the urban space, these new institutional structures, public-private partnerships and things. But what I'm going to focus on in this particular aspect is something that we all know has a very important role on the particular nature of urban governance in India, which is the high degree of informality, but which I think has been insufficiently theorized or has been theorized in very particular ways, which we need to kind of expand how we're thinking about this particular, how informality affects governance and state practices, what its outcomes are, and how we can think of it in the larger sorts of changes that are happening in urban governance, and also I think in terms of how the state kind of engages in the economy in general. So what I'm going to present is a paper called the Iron Cage Meets Makeshift Shed. Iron Cage, as most of you will know, kind of comes from this idea of the barbarian bureaucracy. I will, let me begin now. I haven't exactly timed this, so I will try to stick to the 30 minutes. It's usually around that long. So we have enough time for, and then thank you so much also for the very distinguished discussants, and I'm grateful to get your feedback. It's actually at a very a good time for me because I'm kind of revisiting this and trying to get back to this long overdue book that's based on my dissertation and that includes the different pieces of research together. So the kind of overarching question for this particular paper is how do states govern cities where informality in the economy and built environment is pervasive? And I argue, I use the kind of popular concept of jugaad, which everyone here knows of and which has been recently kind of applied in the social sciences, to argue that, and it's normally been applied in the context of, it's been used a lot in the business literature as a sort of unique aspect of Indian businesses who are resource constrained and they're able to be innovative and do a lot with minimal constraints. It's also been used in some of the urban literature on informal workers, slum dwellers and things who again in the same way are kind of cobbling together, making do, working under constraints. And the state has very often, in the jugaad literature, kind of been the kind of barrier to this sort of adaptation, or the reason that businesses and firms are required to do jugaad because they don't have proper infrastructure or the state doesn't support them. And so often it's this kind of barrier or driver of jugaad. It's not considered part of the jugaad, but what I began to observe, and this is an empirically driven concept, is that what we kind of understand as jugaad practices and things are actually very prevalent in the state, and they end up having a particular effect on the state organization and its capacities itself. They work in certain ways, and in certain ways they also kind of weaken the state. So this work draws on a number of literatures which I try to integrate, there's the urban political economy, politics and governance literature, which those of you who work on cities probably know that much of this is really based on Western cities. I think it's still useful, but a lot of it comes from quite a different context. So then I also draw on the literature on the Indian political economy and development, right? And on the Indian state in general and its role in development, and state-society relations, both in India and just generally in terms of the theoretical literature on kind of modern bureaucratic states. I draw on the literature on the informal economy. So there's a lot of Latin American literature on this, a much longer literature on the informal economy and the role that the state has in producing it. Harris White's work in India, Jan Brahman's work. And of course, there's an extensive empirical literature on Mumbai, which has also been very useful for me. Hansen, Bjorkman, Anjari, and Weinstein. That's particularly because I wasn't able to investigate every space where I talk about these kinds of jugaad practices. My own methods actually ended up being quite jugaad because it started as a comparative case study between Mumbai and Shanghai. The way you would approach it from political science and sociology. I had hypotheses which I was testing. It was focused on state capacity and things. And then when I went and I started doing my field work in Mumbai, I started observing that there were a lot of interesting things going on in terms of governance that were kind of understudied and definitely under-theorized, and they might be more important drivers of how the city actually works in some ways than these kinds of high-level partnerships I had come in to study, which was this kind of state-business relationship and things. And then I kind of ended up extending my fieldwork and ethnography in Mumbai for several years, and I developed this concept and things, and I kept returning to kind of further test it and develop it. And then I triangulated and kind of tested some of these ideas later with published literature, official documents and reports, court rulings and things, so more documentary evidence. So why is this question on the state and the informal economy important? One is, as Barbara Harris White argues, it's that the informal economy is the real economy in India, right? It's not a separate, non-accumulative needs sector, but it's part of this dynamic actually existing real economy. And while it's neither economically nor politically marginal, informal economic activities operate in the margins of state regulatory institutions and formal bureaucratic structures. And this is sort of basically how the informal economy is defined, actually, right? It's not regulated in the same way that the formal aspects of these same sort of economic activities would be. And because of this, it's in large part illegible to the state. And here I'm using legibility and in the sense of James Scott's Seeing Like a State work, where he talks about the kind of fundamental tools that a modern bureaucratic state needs in order to govern. And one of those is to be actually able to see the society and economy it's trying to shape and regulate. So that makes it hard for the state to order and control it through the standard tools of bureaucratic governance and administration. And then what happens in a city like Mumbai and most Indian cities is that given the size and scope of the informal economy, the accommodation and control of informal activities becomes a core task of urban governance in Mumbai. It's not just a marginal process at the edges of the state. Here, this is just a picture from Dharavi, where you can kind of see how mechanized the so-called informal economy is, right? And you really wonder how these large machines got to the slum. And part of the reason they operate in the slum is that it has pretty reliable power and infrastructure, and it's cheap, and it has good transport and things. So, I think this kind of shows both what in informality enables, it allows you to say, have workers who are sleeping, flexible workforce who are kind of accommodated within that structure. But it doesn't in India necessarily kind of bar these enterprises from getting state supports in terms of services or kind of mechanizing, expanding, growing. They're not subsistence type firms in many ways. Informality in the state. So here, like there's a fair bit of literature on the relationship between informality and the state, right? Which sort of argues that informality and the degree, the scale and scope of it is often a product of state capacity and the kind of regulatory structures that the state has. So, and I think this is quite clear that the widespread informality in Mumbai is a product of this mismatch between the state's formal institutional regulatory structures and the organization of the urban political economy. And the informal economy is defined by this vexed relationship with the state. So it's useful, as many scholars have pointed out, for states with limited capacity and will for the enforcement of rules and regulation. In many ways, it works for the state. And that states alternately curbs, formalizes, ignores, accommodates, and collaborates in informal economic activities. So this also has been observed and reported on both in Indian cities as well as in cities, in Latin America and Africa. My first research on how the state deals with informality in this very context-specific ways was actually in New York when I was doing my ethnography class, and I was looking at how the police there deal with street vendors, and they're kind of interesting parallels with India, except there you can say it's a fairly marginal part of the larger economy. And then they also have these periodic crackdowns and enforcement drives, which are not really to get rid of that aspect, with, but to kind of demonstrate state power and its ability to maintain order and rule of law. Why do I use jugaad as a metaphor here? So jugaad becomes a really useful metaphor because it's an inherently ambivalent and complex sort of concept, right? It has, when we talk about jugaad and the way it's used, they're both positive and negative elements. And it was kind of a unique term which allowed me to capture both of that. And you can kind of see it in both these examples, right? You can see what it's doing here is that it's allowing a lot more people to travel on this road and get transport and things than the say proper, just the bike would. So it is working, it's serving a purpose and it's functional. But you can also see this is probably not particularly safe, and it's also reflecting a gap, right? There's probably no good public transport. That's why they're using these sorts of jugaad things. And then the other thing that the concept also inherently captures is that because it means something cobbled together. The term emerged from a particular kind of vehicle where an engine was stuck onto a bullock cart or something, right? It kind of shows how these two things which are able to work together, but there's an inherent contradiction. So that's why it becomes a useful metaphor. And I often find that a lot of the literature which uses jugaad kind of uses it in a very obvious way without necessarily making use of some of this ambivalence and complexity that's there in the. So there's some work on jugaad and corruption, or how youth, and it's fairly literal, but I think it does have a lot more value as a concept because it's able to capture some of these elements. So during my field work, when I discuss state jugaad in practice, I cover several realms of state activity, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but you see it in some fairly obvious ways, which is like the regulation of street vending and informal business activities. Other people have also written about this, like Shapiro and Jaria and all, about informal licenses and things. You see that there's a whole rental market around spaces, vending spaces and things. Then on the production, servicing, regularization of informal and unauthorized settlements and housing. Again, there's a fair bit of work on this. I've done some work on the informal housing markets. Then some of the kind of more surprising areas where I found that these sort of practices were observed is on like property tax collection from unauthorized structures and things. And then on the larger issue of policing, surveillance, and social control. So it's something that's kind of prevalent in pretty much all domains of governance, and it's partly because informality is so widespread. Pretty much nothing can be governed and regulated entirely through formal means and processes. Now, Jugaad governance involves negotiations, bargains, and accommodations around the state's framework of laws, statutes, rules, standards, and protocols that regulate how citizens and firms occupy and utilize space, conduct business, and access public resources and services. What this process of governance does is that it embeds state actors within informal power structures, and there's a sort of informal delegation of power and authority. And these processes do two things, and this is where the jugaadness comes in that it enables a state to maintain social control and oversight, extract revenues, satisfy popular demands, avoid political, administrative, and financial costs that are associated with strict rule enforcement. And over time, it increases state-society interpenetration, and it partially and very unequally incorporates informal spaces within formal state institutions. So what you observe is that state actors at different levels, and this is quite important, right? It's not just a frontline worker kind of thing. Apply improvised, contingent, politically negotiated practices and strategies of governance at variance with official rules and procedures in order to intervene in informal spaces illegible to the formal state. These practices are neither strictly formal or informal, but jugaad. They're adaptive and flexible interpretations of the rules. And this is also important. They're not merely corrupt or rent-seeking or irrational acts of vernacular lower bureaucracy. So a lot of the traditional like political science literature and things would kind of relegate all of this to clientelism or rent-seeking or whatever, or this kind of irrational bureaucracy. But in most cases, they are rational in that they're geared towards realizing legitimate state functions and objectives under the constraints of incongruous legal regulatory frameworks and limited state power and capacity. And I'm just kind of, I don't have time to really go into the empirics here, but I'll just illustrate it with one sort of quote and one sort of example, which is a kind of illegal park, to kind of show that this is not just about venality and corruption, and informal park that violates the obviously violates the master plans, municipal regulations, and all of that. And that's kind of created with using parliamentarian funds and things. And when I'm trying to say that this sort of practices operate at all levels of government, I'm using a quote from the municipal commissioner, right? Who says here, plots get encroached, there's an involvement of politicians and officials, you have these illegal things, you have undesirable transactions, and the matter is settled. All you are required to do is ignore it. The status keeps shifting. You manage to construct something and stay for a few years, get semi-authorized, tolerated, additional slums are brought under toleration. After all, an elected representative is expected to look after voters. After 2000, they are not notified, so we are not obliged to give water and electricity, but it becomes necessary. Lower level officials are involved, and it's something we can't stop. So, you know, very often with senior, at some cases, they're kind of directly involved. I have some examples where they're also, when they start intervening in these spaces, are kind of rationalizing and negotiating and developing these ad hoc kind of jugaad solutions. But here, part of what how the senior officials deal with this is this kind of overlooking or oversight. They know it's happening, but they kind of deliberately ignore it because they know that this is necessary for them to maintain their larger task of maintaining law and order, peace, and social control. So what happens through jugaad, like what are the outcomes? It enables a state to see somewhat like a state. So the state jugaad seat sees the city partially and intermittently, lacking the God's eye view on which rational administration and planning is premised. But that doesn't stop it from trying to do these kind of grandiose, large-scale city plans and things, even though it's able to see at best very partially the city. What happens with this whole pattern of horizontal embeddedness of state actors in local power structures is that it fragments the centralized and hierarchical authority structures, and it dissipates state power. So even though we have formally a very centralized bureaucratic state, particularly in cities like Mumbai, right, and relatively high state capacity, it's quite difficult to get centralized projects and rules and things enforced. And these jugaad strategies weaken organizational coherence. And what also happens is that institutional knowledge inheres in individuals rather than it being something that the state itself has. So you'll have kind of lower level individuals within the state having a whole lot of power because of their networks and information, even though they don't have formal power. And because this is kind of a fundamentally contradictory way of working, and the proper rule following bureaucratic processes are the ones that are meant to be the right way of doing things. So even though it's the norm, it's not normative. There are internal and external pushes for administrative discipline and rule enforcement continuously. So, you know, here is just kind of an illustration of these contradictory sort of logics, right, between the bureaucratic state and the informal city. And both of these both these elements are very apparent in governance in Indian cities. If it was just this informal, like, you know, some of the work Abdul Malik Simnon and all, I think in African cities, it may not be as interesting and complicated. We do know and we do see in many cities that this kind of, you know, bureaucratic rigidity is just as prevalent as this highly informalized system of governance. So this jugaad state is defined as much as this centralized, insulated formal institutions and its modernizing ambitions as by its flexible, negotiated, and improvised governance practices. So here I'm going back to this idea of jugaad being, you know, these kind of cobbled together creations of different, very different sorts of structures. So the jugaad state concept tries to reframe these as more than just corruption and clientelism, while capturing the inherent tensions and contradictions within the state and disjunctions in state-society relations. And here the jugaad state exerts power not by making the exception. So here I'm kind of, you know, arguing against some of the state of exception literature, which is very popular in Indian cities, but by selectively enforcing the rule. Yeah, so, you know, why is this different from existing prevalent theoretical frameworks? Here I'm just discussing the ones used in urban studies. So there's actually existing neoliberalism. I think the problem with that literature is that one is that neoliberalism just becomes this vague and very meaningless term because it's used to explain everything. And it makes a lot more sense in the US and UK context where you can really see a change in terms of governance in what is neoliberal governance versus the kind of earlier, more Fordist models of both the economy and governance. And second, what it does is that, you know, it kind of ignores and doesn't really attempt to theorize or grapple with or understand what the actually existing part is. It just attaches it to neoliberalism. Whereas I think, you know, there's a lot more interesting research to be done on the particular histories, politics, social cleavages. One problem with this aspect is that it seems to assume that the role of business in planning and governance in Mumbai is new, or it's a product of globalization, which is absolutely not true. The other popular sort of literature is a state of exception and informalization of the state, Ananya Roy's work. And one of the biggest problems with this is if you look at where does this literature emerge from, right? The very premise in this literature is that there's a certain a relationship between the state and the citizen, which is the norm, and then there's an exception to that norm. That's just not the case in India. That's emerging out of a European history. We can't just apply this where that basic premise out of which the exception comes, and the norm is not the norm, the same norm. And from that, the question arises, where is the exception when everything is an exception, when anyone can make an exception, right? It's not just the highest level of the state. And it also doesn't look into, while it claims that informalization works for the state, it's not able to really answer the question of why is the state unable to achieve most of its goals in that context. And what we do see in reality is that rather than by making an exception, because exceptions are always there and anyone can make them, the state power is exerted by selectively enforcing the rule, and that power is always available to them. And finally, there's this idea of assemblage, bricolage, which I don't think really highlights the contradictions, tensions, and discontinuities between the state. It kind of, assumes that, I feel it's a good descriptive framework. Of course, there's an assemblage and a bricolage, but it's not telling me what sort of outcomes one can expect and why particular patterns and outcomes keep repeating in Indian cities. And I think that's where the Jugaad state idea might contribute. Finally, what are the questions and implications that emerge from this idea? One is that the Jugaad state governs after a faction, but it lacks the ability to undertake long-term planning or meet citizens' demands through formal state processes. The state resources and capacity to adapt are thinly stretched. And these regularized rule violations end up undermining state legitimacy, and they may undermine public safety, health, and environment. The governance reformers call for transparent, consistent, and strict rule enforcement, depoliticization of state policy. And this also becomes a problem, right? When there's so much of this regularized rule violation and it's associated with corruption, there's this kind of middle-class moral majority sort of movement, a moral minority in India, actually, which is kind of strict rule enforcement. But without whole-scale democratization and transformation of formal rules and institutions, many of these reforms are likely to have anti-poor implications, because in general, the informal poor access the state through local politics and intermediation, through these Jugaad processes. And finally, it raises the question of, does the Jugaad state's ability to incorporate informal groups preclude broad-based political mobilization and resistance, right, of the sort that you see in Latin American cities, that you saw in South Africa and things, right? We don't really have these urban movements in India. And then this question further research can also be in when and where are Jugaad governance practices tolerated and formalized, and when are they curbed and actively restricted? And that when does the state actually decide to use its power to enforce rules and plans, under what circumstances? So I'll kind of end with this and one more slide to kind of throw out for the discussion in terms of why do we need new concepts and theorization. So very often there's a lot of really exciting empirical work right now emerging on urban India. I think people across a range of disciplines have become interested in it. But often, like, the theorization is, what tends to happen is we work with existing theories such as, depending on whichever field, corruption, clientelism, patronage politics, if you're in poli-sci, or state of exception and things. And then what happens is we're not really able to capture the kind of complex sort of differences that are visible in our cities, in global South cities, but it's not just a global South and North thing. It's just that there's so many different things happening in cities at once, and we do need new ways of talking about them. And what often happens is that we all know that these things are going on, but because nobody's published it, we can't really talk about it in the literature, and we can't kind of have these debates around concepts which also help take knowledge forward. And we often don't ask new questions as well, because our questions also remain kind of framed in these concepts of neoliberalism or patronage politics and things. So I do think there's work to be done around conceptualization and theorization, and it's the right time for it on cities in the global South. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
So thank you, Dr. Chattaraj, for your very exciting and interesting as well as provocative presentation. Like as you rightly mentioned, that informality in urban city or in Indian cities is so widespread that it is really indeed difficult to govern those urban spaces according to any specific rules and regulation. And you have highlighted that how the state actually adopts different state practices in the form of different sorts of regulation, regularization, and the different practices to govern these sorts of urban spaces, and how the different state actors as well as the non-state actors with the varied sorts of power at different levels shape these sorts of informalities, and ultimately produces, as you mentioned, that flexible, negotiated, improvised governance practices. And then you have also highlighted that how the popular theoretical framework of this actual existing neoliberalism or the state of exceptions, they may not be that much suitable as far as the Indian cities are concerned to understand the informalization of the urban spaces. And then you rightly calls for the need for new concepts and new theorization. So thank you once again for your these very exciting talks. And now let me move over to our discussion. So may I now start with Dr. Neha Shami. If you please could chip in and share your comments on Dr. Chattaraj's presentation. It's over to you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you everyone at IMPRI for inviting me to be part of this, and thank you, Dr. Chattaraj, for a really interesting discussion and your talk and the research that you presented. I actually think that this is, it's also a very opportune moment in some ways to be talking about informality and governance as we try and come out of the pandemic, and to think about how informality has kind of been brought really front and center over the last 18 months or so, not just through kind of the impact on informal workers per se, but the way in which our governance systems have kind of dealt with and engaged with this question of informality in our cities, whether it is through questions of work or whether it is provision of healthcare or basic social security safety nets. There were a couple of things I think that I wanted to kind of open up as part of this conversation, and I think the first was the question of agency, and as we talk about kind of this idea of Jugaad and the state kind of adapting, I think it's also important to think about sort of where and who within the state is involved in this process, because it's also, as we all know, the state isn't a single kind of homogeneous body, and Mumbai in some ways, as you also mentioned, is really an exceptional city in terms of the kind of power that its city government actually has. And when we look at other cities across India, not very many of them, have that same kind of control, even if it is kind of fragmented. And to think about sort of the role that different layers of states play, right? So looking at the role of the parastatals, for example, and the sort of interplay between them, because there's also sort of informality and this kind of pull and push tension that happens a lot through sort of backroom dealings within the state itself, not only in how the state interacts with those that it is governing, and then also thinking through a little bit about, you know, sort of how states interact, sort of by the state, I mean the state government at this point. So think of the state government and how it interacts with urban local bodies, and the sort of pull and push tension between that as well, and also thinking of how that reflects back to sort of national scales also, because in the last, you know, kind of 6-8 months, we've again seen around the whole sort of GST debate about how, you know, this kind of conversation around who has agency, who controls, you know, sort of funding, where do taxes go, and all of that kind of plays out into sort of, for example, if you look at the, you know, in the case of Bangalore, there's this constant tussle between the BBMP, which is the municipal corporation, and the Bangalore Development Authority, which is sort of the statutory planning body. And so there's a lot of that tension as well. So, you know, I'd be very interested in sort of hearing you unpack a little bit more sort of this question of agency particularly. And then the other thing that I wanted to kind of think a little bit about is also the sort of spectrum of sort of the formal to the informal. And so a lot of the work that I do focuses on questions of development of infrastructure. And you begin to see, as you unpack the process of development of infrastructure, especially these large projects that we're seeing, is that informality actually exists, again, not just in what is kind of labeled or called the so-called informal economy, but within, you know, sort of, you know, very formal consulting processes, for example, where you see people moving back and forth with such fluidity and ease between sort of the private sector, the government. There are instances during, you know, so where we've seen actually people being seconded to, you know, through formal processes, being seconded to private consultants, or, you know, from private consultants into government, but also this fluidity of knowledge that moves back and forth between them. And so to think of it across that spectrum of even within formal spaces, and what counts technically as sort of the formal economy, where we see this kind of, you know, not necessarily what might be counted as, you know, the kind of transparent rulemaking, because that often tends to, you know, kind of cloud the way it's spoken of, especially in a lot of theory, where if it looks in a particular way, if it behaves in a particular way, it must be informal, and therefore a lot of this this kind of plays out in those spaces. And you know, that kind of leads to this conversation around sort of clientelism, around corruption, et cetera, but, you know, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist across other scales as well. So to think about it, you know, in this question of like form informality as existing across a spectrum, where there's, you know, sort of more and sort of less. And the final thing that I wanted to bring up is the question of land. And I think that in a lot of these things, and a lot of the things, especially the specific examples that you brought up in the case of Mumbai, a lot of the negotiations and the kind of transactions, whether formal or informal, are around sort of this fluid, you know, access to tenancy of hold on land, and that often becomes the currency in our cities, especially through which a lot of these other transactions kind of takes place, and becomes sort of this site almost to be able to sort of investigate and unpack some of these questions. And so I'll stop there, and then, you know, we can take more questions and comments later.
Thank you, Dr. Sami, for raising very important issues related to the agencies of and the different layers of the state government apparatus, as well as their controlling mechanism, and also a very fundamental question regarding this fluidity of the entire concept of this informality. And in fact, as Dr. Chattopadhyay also mentioned in her lecture about this Ananya Roy's work on informality, and where she specifically mentioned this, how this informality is produced, like the same set of activities which may be considered as informal, but that may be termed at the same time as formal from some other points of view. So, so I think, Dr. Chattopadhyay, I think we may take all the discussions to you, and then you have the time to respond to all of those questions. So I think that will that be okay for you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So then let me just move over to our next discussion, Dr. Diganta Das. It's over to you for your comments, Das.
Thank you, Dr. Chattopadhyay. Thank you, Dr. Chattaraj. It's really interesting presentation. I really loved the larger presentation. In fact, to start with, actually, I want to say that actually the first phase of your presentation, actually, that's basically talk on urban political economy and governance. The background photo is from Hyderabad, which is the old part of Hyderabad, which is from a vantage of the Charminar, and it actually really talks. The whole context is very interesting. Is that from when you look at Hyderabad as a so-called kind of an competitor to Bangalore and as kind of a knowledge city, but if you see the context of the older part of Hyderabad, which is the vantage of Charminar, where the photo has been taken, and you'll see that it's basically the larger context of everyday urbanism, and that's partly is a mix of formal and informal practices that you can see across the four corridors of the Charminar itself as well, the four roads that cut across. And this is something very important. In my earlier research, I have been working on both Hyderabad and Bangalore, and the context of urban and political economy becomes very important in relation to this context of informality. And looking at today's going through your context, and I really love the context that you ended, is a context of theorizing from South. And there has been a lot of work going on, and there has been a lot of push is also going on from where I am from, Singapore. And then the context of theorizing from state has been pretty much going on, especially in relation to in and around Singapore, is especially Jakarta, Manila, and obviously Mumbai. And to that extent, Fulong Wu's work on Shanghai and the larger Chinese cities are very, very interesting as well. And I think this is something very important that we are actually in relation to this theorizing the debate. I really like the context that you are pushing is about that the hybridity of state, and this is where actually in my kind of context that comes. Dr. Sami already talked about agency. I already wrote about agency here as well, and I think this is something very important. Let me start with hybridity first, and I'll come back to agency. Now, I found that from your larger presentation, I really found this interesting about this jugaad governance between the formal and the state improvisation towards flexibility and flexible regulation. And this actually talks about this hybridity or nature of hybridity of urban governance. And perhaps I was wondering if you could actually unpack a little bit more on this hybridity or processes of hybridity. I believe that your work is mostly work around ethnographic work, and I guess I'd be very interested to know more about this hybridity of urban governance, and maybe in Mumbai context, and in what way this hybridity can be theorized beyond Mumbai. And that's where actually my context is about that. How, I mean, Mumbai is a classic case of informal practices, but this processes of hybridity of urban governance, can it be applied to other cities of global south, not only India, but maybe Jakarta or Manila as well? I think, and that's the larger context will be very interesting from the context, from going back to the theorizing from global south as well. Helga Leitner and Eric Shepard has been working on this context of theorizing, and I think this will be very interesting for me. Agency, I think beyond the state and parastatal and the agency's relationship, my way of looking at it is the context of, often if we don't look at the context of as a human as agency. And Partha Chatterjee has already talked about human as agency in relation to the larger theorization. But I also try to figure out that how state government or para-state or urban local government and government bureaucrats actually work as part of this process of agency and process of learning as well. Learning and relearning itself is very important. And if I can understand that this process of learning, relearning is the process through which the flexibility or the hybridity comes and strengthened as well. So I would be very interested to know more about these processes of learning, relearning, learning from the space, learning from the urban space, and strengthening these processes of hybridity as well. And these are my major 2 points that I was, and overall I really, really liked, and I'll be very interested to know more about it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Das, for your 2 very specific and interesting comments. So let me not reiterate all those points and just quickly move over to our next discussion, Dr. Arindam Biswas. It's over to you, Dr. Arindam.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize that I could not join right on time. I had some other sudden engagement. I had a small baby, so I could not really join on time. But I attended Dr. Chattaraj's presentation from a little bit later, and something is really new for me, especially for the Jugaad governance, and especially the use of the term that you are mentioning about the Jugaad governance, especially in cities. But what I recall is during my research work, I actually use a lot of, or I actually being inspired from Elinor Ostrom's work. Now, it is the governance of a different aspects where the natural resources was being sought out, and I tried to kind of emulate that idea into city, and especially her framework, or and using that in cities, especially in developing countries, because a few things is. First of all, we do not have that kind of an institutionalizations of processes and legislation in our urban areas, and also there are a very lack in terms of a bottom-up approach rather than the top-down approach. If you have a contact in your local urban area, you get things done, or you get things done through, as you rightly pointed out, through corruptions. But there is no process of mechanism of institutionalization of a particular aspect which can give you some even, let's say, your birth certificate or your housing applications or your drainage application or something like that, which is a very kind of a day-to-day activities of municipal corporations or the local urban body, and the relationship with the local people. A few other things that that I also want to point out about the size of the cities, for example. I think there is a very vast difference between these kinds of informality in terms of governance and organizational setup as you move on from smaller cities to larger metropolitan cities. And then it also varies in terms of the level of even the level of infrastructure availability between these cities. Second thing is also about the legislative processes, how it has impacted in terms of our informal or this kinds of an hybrid level of governance, because most of our cities do not have that kind of an decentralized process or the knowledge. I only do not say about the capacity, but also the capability of those people to actually understand the process and then also serve the people, be it planning or development, or be it just providing municipal services to the local people. And we also have a history of following the municipal governance or urban governance process that we have borrowed from the British Raj. And it's a kind of something, it's a mixed match where we segregated. Probably we are the only country in the world which have a segregation between development organization, improvement trust to the local government. And that sort of kind of made our local government very inefficient, because they are only being concerned with their services, and somebody else are actually planning and developing and creating infrastructures, etc., etc. And then there are issues with those problem of areas, and then overlap of different institutions on the same area, providing different services to each other people. Probably these are the kinds of conflicts, and these are the kinds of an scenario we inherited, and that probably led into more informalization, more hybrid nature, rather than very kind of a vertically divided municipal and the development job that we can see in the global north, or even the global west, even in countries like Singapore or even Japan, where it is very like everybody knows what their responsibility, and that's how they probably function. So I'd also like to kind of oppose these kinds of scenario where we experience in terms of day to day, either we call urban governance or metropolitan governance, and different levels, different sizes, and the capacity, different kinds of financial ability of different cities and the city regions. Yeah, probably we would like to discuss more as we proceed further. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biswas, and for your this interesting issues that you have raised. And just before handing over this, or just before going to Dr. Chattaraj, just let me put a very broader issues, because I think this is maybe this is relevant for this entire urban political economy related issues. For example, whenever we talk about these Indian cities in the typical within the much of the urban development discourse, the Indian cities are generally framed as the sites of deficits. Like they are characterized by weak governance, as Dr. Biswas was also mentioning, and immense infrastructure backlogs, the limited access to finance, and so on and so forth. But this deficit frame of understanding of Indian cities, it seems that it fails to account for the heterogeneous ways the service delivery is actually achieved, and the diversity of the governance actors involved in these delivery processes. For example, we talk about that we know that there are severe water shortages in the cities, and especially in the informal settlements, but people somehow, we know that they improvise on water distribution and somehow try to access water for them. So this sorts of hybrid service delivery system, these have evolved as a response of the inability of this a large-scale formal system of infrastructure, finance, development, and these operations to serve the a significant proportion of these informal urban dwellers. So what do you think, like how to recognize these popular modes of service delivery, the complexities in their material and the governance arrangements, and because these are, I think these are crucial, because if we want to identify the new opportunities for urban interventions in the context of Indian cities, then somehow we need to take into account these sorts of informalities into our main policy domain. So what is your take on that? So with this, let me just request you to respond to all the points which our discussants have raised. It's over to you, Dr. Chattaraj.
Okay, thank you so much for your really interesting questions and feedback. And as I said, this is at a very opportune time. Hopefully it will get me back to working on the larger project. Let me begin. I won't be able to go into a huge amount of detail, but I'll try to address the main points that all of you raised. Let me begin with Sami's. So yeah, so the first is this question of agency, and I didn't really have much time to delve into the empirical work. And I see that I think that it kind of applies at two levels. One is really like within the state, which part of the states have power and which don't. And you're right in that Mumbai is quite exceptional in that its city government has a lot more power than in most other cities. But even so, it's not the councillors don't necessarily, right? The municipal commission is still under the state administration. And now there are two things here that we've heard a lot about, this fragmentation and conflict and stuff within the Indian state, and particularly in city administrations and things. And where a comparative framework becomes useful is helping to tease out what is actually unusual and what is fairly common. Now, this kind of bureaucratic fragmentation, if you look in the US or whatever, it's fairly common. These conflicts, the surprising commonalities. What is unusual is that extreme lack of power that local bodies have. And that's kind of where, my initial project, I still use this comparative lens with China. And the kind of traditional example, whatever, typical conventional wisdom is that China gets things done because it's less democratic. And the argument is that India, but in reality, that's not the case. We know we don't have a lot of local democracy. And if you look at the level of agency that local leaders have in China, at the ground level, at the block level, they have a lot more. They don't have political independence, but they have a lot more. In fact, this kind of relates to Soumyadip's question about how do we incorporate informality and practices of negotiation and flexibility into governance. China does a much better job with it. They're given a lot more freedom and flexibility to figure out the political goals are all set at the central level, but various local state agents actually are able to do some of these jugaad practices in ways that are formalized and that they are accepted. And this kind of links now to the second question about the spectrum of formal and informal. Now I kind of begin with this idea that everything is pretty much informal, right? When the vast majority, you have to kind of accept that is almost the norm in India. But I kind of go back to emphasizing the distinction because it has salience, and when we have to recognize that, right? So when I use my examples and I talk of formal and informal, I'm talking to state actors at various levels, and they have a particular and a very clearer understanding of what they see as formal and what they see as informal. So as I said, it's the norm, but it's not normalized. Formal categories still have salience, and as I said, these can be used to exert state power in right. So while I agree, and this, if you look, there's a whole sort of long sociology and political economy literature on informal institutions, and it's a very interesting literature that I think we should actually look at. I think it's in some ways more relevant to understanding informality in the state than the urban informality literature, because you see that there's informality in institutions all across the world. So there's a lot of comparative work and on how formal and informal institutions work together. So even if you recognize as a continuum, it's still analytically useful to draw that distinction, and it's also empirically observable, that distinction. So that's where, so it's not that I'm disagreeing, but there's still a lot of relevance, because as I said, these categories have salience. The question of land is extremely important, and it's really central to a lot of these discussions. I have another paper on Mumbai, which I'm kind of using the whole rent-seeking, rent-sharing sort of thing. And it's not just land, it's urban space in general and how that runs those markets. And I think what I'm trying to do in the larger book is kind of connecting this issue of land and how this informal control over urban land becomes a source of power, and it becomes a source of agency, and it becomes a way to, when we have it, we have formal corporate industry, and we have the kind of large scale parastatals and things, but we also have a lot of fairly significant power that's obtained by these individual actors in cities because of their ability to control and consolidate land. And that's a kind of larger story. And I think this, Mumbai is a particular sort of case, but it kind of happens everywhere. And you see that through the SR, like you have these actors emerging out of nowhere. And their power of the land and urban space ultimately gives them political power as well. And they have a pretty strong role in determining what happens within the city and challenging some of these formal processes and things because of their ability to control and consolidate land. And often it's because fairly high level, powerful political actors are not always able to kind of do these sort of complex negotiations you need. So in a way that land, and this is kind of, I did, there was I did work on the DMIC and all after that. And it's exactly what you say, these in the most formal large scale mega projects is where you have, and what's happening there is that unlike in Mumbai, where you have that tension, and it's ultimately, as Soumyadip said, I think it's a functional, it's not an ideal governance system, but it's not just a story of deficit. It's something that's able to work. But in some of these DMIC areas, there's a complete institutional vacuum. So you have on this one hand, this big distinct that like no presence of actual government there. So you have a high degree of informality, and you have these kind of they're not government bodies, they're not actually, they're parastatals, they're not representative government. So you have this very, very strange situation where in fact, that is in some ways the most informalized institutional vacuum sort of space I've been in has been the kind of DMIC site, the mega project site in Uttar Pradesh. That kind of leads to this issue of hybridity. And there are two types. There's hybridity within the state, and then there's this, well, maybe heterogeneity is the word here, this enormous heterogeneity of how governance works across Indian cities. So what you're seeing in a Mumbai, where you do have a fairly effective state and it's fairly functional, and it is able to deliver services, and then you have some of these other, Greater Noida is another one of those supposedly planned cities where there's an actual vacuum of governance. And I think that's where the deficit is much more. They may have infrastructure, but there's almost no system there for the poor to get infrastructure. And I think there's, a good way of us understanding both hybridity and heterogeneity will be to look more comparatively across Indian cities. And that will sort of, I think also take this theorization further on the issue of hybridity. So, what I would think is that the Jugaad state is one particular form of hybridity within the state. And I think there are elements of that in pretty much in most state structures, right? We won't find any purely bureaucratic or purely informal, but there's probably a continuum. And I think, that might be this idea of hybridity within the state. It might be an interesting idea for a conference or something like that, or especially what was surprising is to see this kind of level of flexibility and informality and hybridity even within say a state like China or Singapore. So I think that does call for further theorization or more comparative work, where Jugaadness may be a particular form of hybridity and there are other sorts of hybridity. But I think when I presented this work, I pretty much found that there's a lot of resonance with people in Latin America, Africa, and there's similar concepts that they have also for these very Jugaad-like practices, System D, which is Jetino in Brazil, and funnily enough, in Europe, it's when I present to Italians, they get it at once. And looking at some of the kind of old literature on Italian urbanism and things, you'll find a lot of these similar patterns of this kind of very fragmented, networked systems of governance, but you also have this formal state structure. And I think the big difference, as Arindam pointed out, these are kind of inherited from colonial systems. So I think in many of the big cities where we do see this, it's because we have these bureaucratic Weberian colonial institutions which pretty much function the way they did. And then in some cities, we also have this overlay of these development authorities and things, all of the parastatals. And then we have a whole lot of other places where there's either a very weak sort of local government, or it's not clear who's actually running the things. And those are informal in completely different ways. And those are also politicized in completely different ways. And it's kind of worth seeing how they work. And then we also have, in both Kerala and Gujarat, we have fairly functional local governments, which in Kerala are much more democratic. And they are able to maybe, have more of this kind of synergies and co-production and things like the, Ostrom-like things. And in Gujarat, it's a little bit like the China model in that, they have you can see they have a lot of administrative capacity, right? They kind of know, they may not be very democratic or have that much agency, but you know, they're quite well organized. They are, in fact, actually, and they use it for different reasons, but they do have a much better sense of what they're doing in terms of planning, service delivery, as far as infrastructure goes. They're fairly qualified people within the state. So there is a lot of this heterogeneity that I think is worth examining. And then we have cities which we focus on, but we have a lot of these urbanizing areas that aren't even cities. You know, they don't necessarily have boundaries. They don't have an institution. It's really not clear who governs that. So I think those are the kinds of questions that also we need to understand, and what happened. And I think at some point, probably most of Indian urban dwellers will be living in those spaces, and maybe for them especially, these ideas of jugaad or something becomes kind of important, because we do need something more ground, some sort of way when there are no formal institutions and structures and systems. How can people actually get the services they need and things? So I think that's a key question, which is how can some of these kind of more informal and bottom-up processes be institutionalized, and not just through this decentralization 76 amendment, because that's not really happening. In a way, they need to be institutionalized because they're already there. And I think these governance systems do emerge. And why do they emerge? What are their outcomes and things? You can't have a city or an urban area that's ungoverned, but what is actually emerging when there isn't a formal structure of government? You know, most places we talk about how unplanned cities are, but very often it doesn't matter. The big cities are still able to function. There are a lot of areas where there is nobody who has that the job of planning, of providing services and things like that. And the other surprising thing that I found is that you know, where the formal also kind of becomes important because it remains the norm, is that I think governments almost anywhere else in the world have been better at dealing with informality than in India. This kind of, right from China, as I said, they're able to routinize informal processes. I've seen in the UK and like this recognition that they need to kind of work with informality is far more than in India. I think in India, this kind of the form, like even during this COVID pandemic, for instance, if you see the kind of bizarre rules that come where the state decides exactly what hours shops should be open, how many people, and there's no logic. It's not really rational administration, or kind of the state decides that there'll be a night curfew or X shop. Like it's also not necessarily corrupt or interest based. It's just this kind of arbitrary top-down decision making where formal rules have to be followed for no good reason. It's also there when it comes to, again, the pandemic has highlighted a lot of this, right? Why people who should have been getting relief and supplies were not given them, because there were all these rules about eligibility, which really did not make sense. And I think most other states are really able to say, well, you know, one, to just not have them because they don't make sense in such a case, right? You have a universal system. But in India, that we should still have these very, very strict rules for paperwork, for eligibility, to get a vaccine, to get relief supplies, to you know, get social security, even if you're informal. You know, those are very strange, and that's where it's in some ways it's important to problematize, as they say, the formal, right? Like you know, that might be a bigger problem in India than the informal. The nature of the formal might really be where we need to kind of reform things, not in the informal. But yeah, that's sort of the last point. But thanks so much for your comments. I think they'll be useful for me going forward.
Thank you for your detailed response to almost all the issues which have been raised by our discussion. So, so let me just, as Dr. Arjun mentioned, like let me just quickly move over to our discussions for some quick thoughts if they want to have on your responses. Let me start with again, Dr. Neha.
No, actually, not a whole lot more to add, but I look forward to continuing a conversation around this. And I think that it's absolutely right that I think that, we do need to kind of unpack this question of governance a lot more than we do currently when we talk about our city. So I'll just leave it at that and kind of look forward to continued conversations.
Thank you, Dr. Neha. And then again, it's over to you, Dr. Das.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Chattaraj. I think I totally agree that the context of hybridity and heterogeneity comes together, I believe. And there are, in fact, the context that you're talking about is that the comparative processes and the comparative urbanism. And I guess that actually comes to the context that I was talking about, learning from cities or learning from this comparative kind of context as well. I guess this actually at the end of the day is kind of goes back to the context of how to theorize from South. And then I think this is something very interesting, and I guess it's a continuous discussion, and I'll be very happy to have this discussion going on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Das. And now it's over to Dr. Biswas if you have any specific points that you want to make.
A few things probably I missed in the first one.
Yes, please.
One thing is about the transaction cost. Now, when we theorize on the basis of our observations, there is another thing which I feel needs to be done is to analyze. Now, before we do a certain degree of analysis, it is very difficult, as you pointed out, to theorize in terms of what is happening, especially from the global South or even the developing or emerging economics perspective. Now, the first thing what I feel when we go for theorize is the analysis, and there has to be a solid kind of an empirical evidences that comes out of a very, it might be a very structured or unstructured levels of analysis. So how do you kind of analyze in terms of either in terms of a framework or the data, or given that we have so much data deficiency in our cities, and it's very difficult when we go for theorizing based on your sample survey to theorize something which is this large and this complex and this kind of a conflicted, what I may say. So in traditional governance, I'm not very that much, I do not work that much in terms of political part, but in terms of the governance, when I do research, I find it's very difficult to create an analytical framework to, first of all, analyze the governance process. In many cases, people uses like transaction cost or even land or other kinds of very formal and very mathematical processes, so that we can establish some sort of or we can see some sort of pattern, and then probably we can theorize, because unless and until we have a large numbers of patterns, I think it's very, very difficult to theorize. So what's on your take on that about theorizing urban governance or governance? It might be urban, local, or metropolitan or rural, whatever, but the governance which actually be the nearest to the people, which provides the most essential services to the people.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Biswas. Now it's over to you, Dr. Chattaraj, to directly respond to
Thanks.
the points.
So I would definitely like to keep these conversations alive, because they're very interesting, and I hope they don't end now. But on Dr. Biswas's, I think that's a really important point, like this whole issue of methods. And I've often thought of doing a kind of methods paper of like, how do you do research when almost everything is a gap, right? There are data gaps, there are theoretical gaps, there are conceptual gaps. And when I started My degree is in public policy, right? And that's entirely quantitative. And there was quite a lot of pressure to have a quantitative component, but there's very little data, especially at that time. I think that the availability of data has improved since then. But when I started my field work, which was more than a decade ago, there was very little. And so then what I did is like what you do in kind of comparative politics or public policy. You have a kind of formal analytical framework where you decide your cases, you choose variants, you have a design, you draw on theory. And as I said, it started as that. But what I found then is that these existing analytical frameworks here, that they didn't really explain much, or they didn't help me understand what was going on. And I think that's where concept development becomes really important. So even pre-theorization in terms, because it kind of lets you give a name to something that we all know is happening. And then there's a further process where that becomes further kind of developed, operationalized, measured. Once you become, and that becomes, and then it kind of helps you ask different questions and collect data on different questions and things. And I think in India, both kinds of things are important. Like there's a huge need for more data and more empirical work. And I think particularly on these really important central questions of at what level of government should decisions about basic services be made. And I think those are in some ways traditional theoretical questions. We don't have the data to answer them. So I think for those, we really do need to start like doing a lot of comparative empirical work across cities to kind of help establish that. And then for some of these new sorts of things that we're observing, or that we know existing theories don't explain, that they're puzzling, one thing that's useful for me, comparison is always useful, because otherwise there's just so much going on in Indian cities and so little of it is studied. At least these urban planning, land questions, we do look at. Urban politics still remains really understudied. Social cleavages remain understudied. These new kinds of subcultures and things that are emerging in cities, all of those things, these various non-state sort of movements that are emerging, whether it's these kind of the good civil society, and here we're thinking of these kind of climate justice sort of movements, to the bad civil society, which is the kind of cow vigilantism and things, right? And in many of these northern cities, they are actually the people who are governing cities. So I think for all of those things, that is sort of where we need to start naming and theorizing, so that they become objects for research and analysis and empirical investigation and things, rather than continuing on this whole neoliberalism state of exception train, which I don't think is really either revealing to us enough about the nature of our cities, or really helping us come to some sort of a solution of how do we make sure that they're more inclusive, more democratic, that they're better able to provide decent jobs and services and things for people. So yeah, I'll end there.
Yeah, so thank you. So it's really theoretically very much enriching. So it's a wonderful lecture. So thank you once again for your lecture, and also for finding some time to give a talk to this IMPRI's City Conversation series. And also I'm thankful to all the discussions, all our esteemed and distinguished discussions. So yes, so as it has been observed, that the spatial and the political space which afforded by this informal governance regime in Indian cities stands in stark contrast to the formal governance regime in India. And there are multiple governance actors, and so it is improper to bank on a so to say the singular mode of governance. And we need to recognize the multiplicities of the governance, which will enable us to understand and to determine how and by whom this urban space is accessed and used. So we will continue with these sorts of discussions in near future as well, and we hope all of you will find again some time to attend and join this IMPRI's City Conversation series. So with these notes, let me now invite Dr. Arjun to say something and formally provide the vote of thanks. Over to you, Dr. Arjun.
Thank you, Soumyadip sir. I have written a lot of questions, but
yes,
nevertheless,
please ask.
Should I ask a few to Shahana ma'am? Ma'am,
I have another meeting, but
yes.
We can hopefully continue this conversation. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes. So let me wrap and propose a formal vote of thanks. Yes, I will share some of the questions over email. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for this very enriching lecture and deliberation today. And on behalf of IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at the IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute, we thank all of you, those who have joined here and watching at Facebook and later watch at YouTube and listen at our podcast to our series, The State of Cities, #City Conversation, and today's lecture on urban political economy and governance, focusing more on Shahana ma'am's work on Jugaad governance. We are so thankful for our speaker, Dr. Shahana Chattaraj ma'am, for enlightening us and also putting so much of effort towards this lecture, and Dr. Arindam Biswas sir, Dr. Diganta Kumar sir, and Dr. Neha Sami ma'am, and of course Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay sir, and IMPRI team for having this very enriching deliberation. And with that, we wish you a very good night. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.